go.
What's up, everyone? Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Ask You Anything. My name is Jordan Lambuth. I'm a service owner here at Moser, doing some kind of consulting work, a little this, that, and the other. So, the topic of this week's episode is where business expectations collide with IT execution. So, I have a distinguished guest, Mr. John Caviness, one of the directors here at Moser. Hey, John, thanks for hopping on.
Great to be back. Also great seeing you, Jordan, and excited to talk about our topic today.
Definitely. So, one of the things I'd like to open with is it sounds like you have a lot of experience with consulting work. So, from your consulting work, how would you describe kind of the gap between business and IT, and how do you feel about that getting better or worse over the years?
It's always interesting in consulting when Moser is an IT consulting firm, and a lot of our clients either do or don't have an IT presence of their own, but there's always a business presence, right? So
Hmm.
most of the stakeholders I talk to are business people, not necessarily IT folks. But the kind of like core problem I've recognized is that there's this perception that the IT business gap is based on communication, but it's really an incentive problem. Both sides are measured by different definitions of success, which means that this kind of misalignment isn't necessarily a failure, it's a predictable, rational outcome because they're not
Hmm.
speaking the same language, their priorities are different. Both sides are doing their job, and that's almost, it's weird to say it, but that's also the problem, right?
Hmm.
Business
Yeah.
leaders and business units, they're measured on speed, revenue, and outcomes, right? Whereas
Right.
IT is measured on stability, security, and quality of delivery. Since those two scorecards are kind of almost always in conflict, there's going to be this gridlock. What's perceived as a dysfunction is really a rational behavior. But the fix to me is it's not, building a better relationship between both sides. It's really fixing the incentives between the two. So kind of at the highest level, that's where I think the biggest gap is this incentive between both sides being different.
I could say that. Yeah, kind of like the left hand doesn't necessarily know what the right hand is doing, and like the people at the top, they've got kind of different things that they're worried about. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. IT speaks in effort, business speaks in outcomes, and necessarily neither is wrong. How do you feel when it comes to kind of that in this context?
And it obviously depends a little bit on what kind of IT issues going on or what's happening, right? But
Right.
say a developer says that the new rollout of a feature is going to take 6 weeks and a VP says we need it in two. That's no longer a technology conversation, right?
Right.
That's having a negotiation to essentially try to find this middle ground where what's technically deliverable in over the course of maybe 6 weeks. Maybe it's more, maybe it's less, right?
Right.
Unexpected conditions will arise often in development, but the business is saying we need it in two, right? So that dynamic in itself creates a problem, right? And it's tough because it isn't often spoken about, but within an internal or external IT function for an organization, that dynamic comes up all the time. What's feasible versus what's desired by the business. I think anyone who's worked in IT knows the I need it yesterday type of email or statement in a meeting when realistically there's, tons of things that can get in the way of that, which make that conversation almost one-sided. It's go ahead and do it. We need it done. When as anyone who does work in IT knows, the factors that go into making a successful rollout. If I'm going to lean on that development example, if you rush it, it's not going to be as good. There's going to be bugs. Maybe there's a
Hmm.
security issue. Maybe you end up spending more money just to get it up and running in that shorter time frame if you're using an external consultant or a internal IT developer, app developer, web developer, what have you. They're going to have to completely reprioritize their schedule, right? And often that leads to burnout, which
Hmm.
is a whole other topic that I know we're not touching on today, but it's a very real thing because of this incentive issue that I mentioned, right? Between the two sides of the table.
Definitely. At the end of the day, you still have to like eat, sleep, and feed yourself, and the resources kind of have to change in a sense. Like I either need to put more resources in, meaning like money or time, bringing in more people or something like that to try to spread that load to get it done a little faster, things like that. But Yeah, I can see where you're going
Yeah.
with. I've heard a lot of digital transformation and kind of that word thrown around in kind of our space. So I feel like that sometimes will fail at the seam, not necessarily at the core. What's your kind of take on that?
It's always tough with digital transformation because that has meant so many different things over the years, right? Like in the
Right.
most recent iteration, it takes the shape of, how do we implement AI? Can we get something out there that makes people's lives easier? In the past, it was more oriented on, we need to update our website or change our ERP or completely overhaul how we do X, right?
Hmm.
But typically, when I see a digital transformation failure point in the real world, it's often because it's not really about the technology itself. Treating a digital transformation as an IT project instead of an operating model change, that is a mistake, right? The problem often also is though maybe the top end of an organization really wants to champion and get this thing done, right, over the
Right.
course of a digital transformation. The frontline employees might also welcome it, but in the middle gets frozen, right? There's usually a lot of process changes that come with that, which lead to stalls, which lead to breaking down of that overall initiative. More often than not, most of these digital transformation efforts, and if I'm going to lean on AI as an example in our modern times, right? Pilots don't always scale. And AI is a good example of that because the most successful implementations of an AI use case are going to be very narrowly oriented, right? The
Right.
broader you build it, the less effective it is at all the things that you're trying to get it to do. Whereas if you build a pilot for, let's say, a document scraping AI, you throw a bunch of documents in a library, you targeted it with an AI, you build in some prompts that you know people are going to ask based on what's in there. That's likely going to be more effective than, say, this bold future we see a lot where that exact use case may not work for every department. The types of documents, the types of things that they're working with will be different. Additionally, when you think about an overall transformation, there's going to be a budgeting process, some kind of steering committee or stakeholder group that's going to be pushing for it, right? And making
Right.
sure it happens. But one of the tricky things is when the project closes, oftentimes, yes, they've done the transformation. The new product has launched, for example. There's this large likelihood that the business is just going to revert back to whatever it did before
Yeah.
because maybe it wasn't fully bought into. Maybe there was an element of complexity in that frozen middle, like I was talking about earlier, where management versus workers versus leadership are all on different kind of like stages of the rollout or understanding it or knowing what it's used for. But the ultimate problem, I think, when you look at digital transformation beyond those things I listed is it's going to be the handoff when the IT department hands it to the business. And there's always this desire to have this kind of educational point when a new thing gets rolled out. And that isn't always the best thing for IT people to do, right? Yeah, maybe they understand how something is built and why it works, but do they know how to speak to the business users that are going to end up using it, right? Do they know what the boots on the ground need out of that system on a day-to-day basis? Likely not, right? So part of the solve in my mind, and this is always a highfalutin idea, if you will, is it should be that frozen middle that's really kind of on top of the education and rollout piece. You need to have someone stewarding this new thing for the people who are going to use it. Should IT be involved in providing them things to say from a technical standpoint? Of course. But I think the best people to ultimately get people's buy-in and usage and adoption of a tool is going to be, their manager going through and explaining, hey, how you used to do process X is now this way. Instead of it being, here's a knowledge base guide that the IT guys wrote that is focused more on how you sign in and has
Right.
some red arrows telling you where to type your password, maybe that isn't necessarily enough, right?
Right.
So that's the seam where Oftentimes in consulting, we earn our keep because we take the time to understand what the boots on the ground folks need out of whatever the system is, right? We take the time to write more specifically oriented documentation to hand off to those stewards that I mentioned earlier who are going to help people actually adopt that thing. So I know that's a lot to say on a pretty broad question, but I thought they were all kind of important things to point out because I'm sure in our audience base, there's probably people considering AI, other digital transformation efforts. So I hope those lessons that I've seen over the course of my career help them think about how they want to approach those changes as they want to make them.
Sure. Yeah, very broad answer for a very broad question. It makes sense. So I know you and I are no strangers to the onboarding process and new clients, right? So what
Mhm.
would you say are some of the early signs that business and IT are misaligned?
In our world as external consultants, when we get a new client, and I think I've had this conversation quite a few times with folks internally, but it's good to share externally, right? You kind of know very quickly if the business has kind of a bad like history with their IT department, whether it's internal or a previous provider, based on how they're going to approach when a situation comes up. In the recent past, as we got this new client, we sought to get information from the previous provider and we got some. But one of the key details that they left out was an integration with their ERP system, right? That relied on a pretty important but simple technology to work effectively. Over the course of that handoff, when that issue inevitably came to light while we were still discovering how everything's set up and how everything's connected, an urgency was placed on that issue. Obviously, from the business standpoint, they need that fixed as soon as possible because it's a line of business application, right? What's important to understand, though, is why am I telling this sort of example? Because how they approached that issue coming up in relation to us as their new provider, you can almost read it between the lines to say, oh, they've been burned badly by a previous provider not giving them a, expected resolution timeline, details on where
Yep.
things stand, right? So being able to communicate back to the organization and say, hey, we're on top of the issue. We're doing what we can. Our best effort is this. From an estimate resolve standpoint, we need to hop on a meeting to discuss. So that way it's not dying in emails and perception doesn't take over. One of the things that business people often do that maybe IT people don't always do is do interpersonal exchanges either on the phone or in a meeting, right? In person or virtual. Business people are almost always in, maybe not back-to-back meetings, but often in direct human contact where they have follow-ups afterwards. In the IT world, most IT professionals are capable of, going an entire day without being in a meeting and not needing it, or maybe not needing to pick up the phone to do their job. But by the same token, part of bridging the gap from a communication standpoint, maybe not an incentive standpoint, is how we communicate with customers or how IT departments in general communicate with the business that they serve. Because I think we've all had the early morning stand-up meeting because something poor is going on at an org and the business needs an update as to where it is and where it's going, and that is the best forum for that. But it's always difficult when that sort of I'm trying to figure out how to characterize it, but as soon as you kind of acknowledge that attitude and perception of IT early on from the business, it takes a lot
Right.
to repair that, right? You have to undo the sins of the past in a way, which is it's a tough spot for the provider, but it's an important thing to recognize and address, right? Because you don't want to continue to do the things that the business doesn't necessarily accept. And if I were to go back to that story about that handoff of that ERP system integration, that got resolved. Our team leaned in, got it done same day as soon as it came up, which I'm proud to see because our consultants are really the due diligence and level of detail that they'll dig into to address a major issue like that. If it was an internal IT department, maybe one of the guys on the team is already knowledgeable and can jump in and he has to, get on his laptop while he's on PTO or something, right? Which happens a lot.
Hmm.
Anyone who works internal IT at an organization has gotten that phone call while you're on a family vacation and hey, this system's down and you're the only one who understands it. Drop everything and hop on it, man, because we need it to work. Sorry. But All that to say, the biggest challenge is overcoming those sins of the past in my mind. That would be the same case even if it wasn't an MSP to organization relationship and you're just a new IT person at an internal position at a business. You can feel that friction. But
Right.
I have seen it where, depending on the organization, some of them recognize that the incentives of IT are different, that the measures of success for IT are also different. Not necessarily how they approach requesting help is that different, but they give a little bit more grace. They kind of have that understanding that, oh, if the developer's telling me it's going to take 6 weeks to get this done and I really need it done in two, instead of forcing the developer to produce something that isn't going to be as good, maybe we need to change our business timeline, whatever our rollout is associated with it. Maybe there's a marketing campaign. Maybe there's some internal process changes that are supposed to be tied to this. Sometimes businesses will recognize that the IT side needs to be proper for the business side to actually get the benefit it wants. And when those moments happen, I'm always pleased to see it because one, it's good for everybody involved, right?
Hmm.
But also that shows a level of maturity from an organization. Because most businesses, and this is probably a tagline that everyone's heard, they run on IT systems. It's 2026.
Hmm.
There was a time in the past where you could get away with not having an email address and not having a website and your name's in the phone book, and you didn't need to have infrastructure for IT. You could just have guys doing work or gals doing work and just have paper copies of everything. But in 2026, every business to some extent runs on an IT system, and the exceptions to that, I would love to hear them because those sound like fun places to
Right.
work to an extent. A lot less
Yeah.
problems from an IT standpoint, but they're few and far between. But anyways, Jordan, I'm sure you have more questions. Sorry to
Oh,
take
you're
so
good,
much
man.
airspace.
That's all good. When I think we touched on this briefly, but when I think of customers that actually have kind of closed that gap between business expectations and IT execution, I think of one customer in particular that my point of contact is a CFO, so high level executive that is able and capable to kind of make those decisions. He's on board with IT. If we present something to him and he sees value in it, he's very interested in kind of going down that path. And their systems and kind of software they use, it's good. It's like it's new. It's not like something with like an old expired warranty. It's got support. It's almost to the point where I have a hard time recommending stuff to improve to them just because their stuff is already so good, which something you don't see a whole lot.
Yeah, and what I've always found interesting about because this is very common, right?
Mhm.
Organizations that have someone in finance leading IT, is that those individuals, all their wealth of knowledge around the business and what makes it function, often do put a great stake in the IT and how effective it is and how it serves their
Right.
organization. Because not only do they know what the cost of every laptop is that they've bought in the past 5 years, or how much they're spending each month on their licenses might be, but they're the ones that are capable if asked, right? How long does an outage actually cost the organization, right? Say a main system goes down and they need to do their minute by minute calculation of how that impacts, manufacturing production. Pick your industry, there's going to be some translatable effect. They almost always have that just ready to go, right? And to have that already in mind makes it more advantageous for that organization to recognize and be resilient about a problem they have and to want to do something about it. Whereas I will say other times there is going to be a different person who's responsible for IT. Maybe they're not in the C-suite. Maybe they don't have any information technology background. I've seen all sorts over the course of my career, but their priorities are going to be different. Their acknowledgement of how IT and the business work together or don't, right, are going to be different. And that's always a complicated thing for an organization to have to deal with. Because, when the two sides essentially are measured by different definitions of success, there's going to be that predictive failure, right?
Right.
And the solve there isn't necessarily completely overhauling the relationship between the two groups. The best bridge is to have someone who has a joint responsibility to both sides and a joint understanding of both sides. You can throw around terms like value owner or something like an accountable leader over the joint outcome between the two groups. People love to throw around the word champion. But if your title has champion in it at an organization, that's pretty neat. But usually it's not going to be that. But
Right.
whatever this role is, their focus needs to essentially rely on both sides, get both sides understanding and what their needs are, be able to look at both the profit and loss exposure for both the IT and the business side. They need to have a mutual understanding that while accountability problems are often dressed up as communication problems, the incentives need to be the same for both groups. And what could those incentives be? It's going to depend quite a bit on the organization situation and what kind of makeup they have in IT. But the business side will always care the most about making sure that prioritization is done based on need that translates into money coming in. And IT is often going to look at not necessarily the same thing. It's going to look at things like how reliable is a system to keep the business making money, or how do we effectively improve without taking money away from the business's bottom line, right? There's always going to be this play where return on investment is measured differently by both sides. But if organizations were to take the time to not necessarily collapse accountability onto one person, but share it between the two groups in a way where it's healthy instead of one side kind of beating down the other or the other side not necessarily measuring up because success hasn't really had a good definition. The companies that I have seen do this sort of thing appoint some kind of steward between two parties. Maybe some of them outsource that to a virtual CIO or another type of role, because there's plenty of roles that function like that. The ones that do that tend to get the most out of their IT and their business improves, right? It becomes more profitable. They get a good roadmap put together. The business is aligned to it. There's not necessarily going to be this totally reactive. Hey, this problem came up. Fix it now, fix it yesterday. It'll be more of a, hey, this problem came up. Here's what IT has done to kind of be prepared for that sort of situation. There's a backup process. There's a different method of achieving that goal. One thing that organizations rarely allow IT to do is have those sort of effective backup processes and systems because it costs too much money, right? And IT doesn't always make the best value argument back to the business that if you don't want to lose money, we need this thing. I know it costs money, but to prevent that loss, this is the best way forward, which is why I'm kind of making this argument for this candidate of a joint lead between the two to effectively bring that to the table and say, oh, well, the business's budget can't really do that until X date. IT, has been stemming the bleeding with this consistent problem, but they'll continue to do that until the budget allows us to do that other system to prevent the outage and prevent that minute by minute money loss. Sorry, that was a lot, Jordan.
No, you're fine. That's all good, man. I know we talked about having someone kind of playing both sides of the fence, kind of looking into this as like an advocate, but I'm not trying to take up too much of your time. So, one last question and then we'll close here. But if you had to give, let's say, one piece of advice to a business leader that's listening right now, or one kind of like a structural change, what kind of thing would that be? Is there anything besides the person playing both sides of the fence?
Yeah, I'd say that other than appointing someone to be that sort of steward between both worlds, one of the most important things I think any business should often do is take a time to have an internal conversation between IT and the business and be vulnerable. It's not going to be an easy conversation, but you gotta air some grievances. You gotta take the time to recognize that there's a resilience to the organization and the IT, but that there's things that can't quite get done with what is today, right? Explore those gaps, be resilient, think about, do we need to do some outreach externally to address something? Or is there a plan that needs to be made that can help make everyone's lives better at that organization? That's the big invitation, other than find someone to lead that charge, is take the time to recognize that there is likely something. Someone isn't telling the business, or the business isn't telling IT, that if it got addressed, things would be better. So I think that's probably the one piece of advice I would give any business leader, is have that conversation.
Awesome. Well, that's cool. I appreciate your time today, John.
Of
Um,
course.
Everyone, thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time. And until then, this is Ask You Anything.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Ask You Anything, brought to you by Moser Consulting. Be sure to join us next time when we dive even deeper with our resident experts and explore what they're currently working on. Don't forget to share your ideas or topics with us on social media. And in the meantime, please remember to give us a rating and subscribe to our feed wherever you get your podcasts. Until then, so long, everybody.
Go.